So I think by now we all know what happens when these glasses go on. There's kind of a couple of interesting stories out of the UFC. Well, I should say, okay, let me correct that. There was one interesting story related to the UFC, and there was one that was a little bit less interesting. But really, both of them actually kind of tell us some very interesting things about one particular fighter. That particular fighter is going to be the guy in the main event this upcoming Saturday, talking about Sean Strickland. So let's start with the less interesting story. Strickland had some interesting things to say about the Super Bowl halftime show. I don't really pretend to understand what it is about Bad Bunny that set a particular type of person off as much as it did. I mean, it's not the kind of music that I listen to, but the Super Bowl, they don't ever seem to use the kind of music in the halftime show that I listen to. I mean, I do kind of feel like, you had the Super Bowl in San Francisco this year. It's probably going to be the last opportunity to have Metallica play a Super Bowl halftime show, like in a Super Bowl in San Francisco. I do think that the NFL dropped the ball here. But that doesn't mean that I'm going to go completely unhinged and use the F slur against Bad Bunny. That's not my style. And while the algorithm, I make the algorithm hate me. There's a lot of things that I'll say that the algorithm doesn't like. That's not one of them for me. Now, the reason why I bring this story up is not so much because it in itself is an interesting story, but because it does tells us something that we all know about Sean Strickland deep down. That is that deep down in his core, there's a huge part of Sean Strickland that he's an asshole. Like there's no other good word to use to describe it. He's a bit of an asshole. But he also happens to be one of those assholes. Sometimes he just says and does things that are just, at best, cringy. Like, in my opinion, at worst, cringy. I'm very rarely, vehemently outraged at anything that Sean Strickland says, but quite frequently he'll do and say things that I just find completely and utterly cringy. That's not a crime. That's not a crime, and it's no reason why, he should be canceled or anything like that. I mean, really, in spite of some of the things that I've recently had to say about Ryan Reynolds, I don't necessarily believe in, cancel culture per se. I mean, I do believe in consequences and accountability, but I think that's a little bit different than a flat out cancel mob. So you never really Sean Strickland would have to do something awfully bad in order to get me to join an actual cancel mob. I don't find him particularly malignant. I just think he's the kind of asshole that it's pretty easy to cope with, and I cope pretty well with Sean Strickland. Now, with that in mind, Sean Strickland also happens to be one of those assholes that doesn't actually shy away from saying the thing that is so often true. And as it so happens, there was recently an altercation backstage at a UFC event involving Sean Strickland, Jon Jones, and Jon Jones's brothers that falls into that category. Apparently, Jon and his two brothers are extremely angry at Sean Strickland because Sean Strickland says a lot of things that are true. And it seems like Jon Jones is not the kind of guy who likes it when you say things about him that are true, because it seems that the things about Jon Jones that most readily come to mind as true are not very good things to say. And you know what? I don't care if he likes it or not. I have talked about Jon Jones quite frequently on this podcast, and yeah, pretty much every time that I have to bring him up, it's because of something negative. And so if Jon Jones and his brothers have a problem with Sean Strickland talking about negative things about Jon Jones that are true, man, I don't care about that. I could not in a million years look at Sean Strickland as being the problem in all of this. But I think that the detail that Jon Jones's two brothers were involved in this altercation is very telling. So let's just take a moment and we'll rewind a little bit and we'll just kind of talk about the altercation. Sounds like really there was not necessarily that much to talk about. It wasn't like they had a backstage fight or a backstage brawl or anything of the sort, not even a pushing match. But at a recent UFC event, Sean Strickland saw Jon Jones backstage with two of his brothers, and he said that Jon Jones and his two brothers, they were eyeing him. They were giving him the stink eye, they were mean mugging him. And Sean Strickland basically said that from his perspective, it kind of felt like these guys were trying to provoke him. And honestly, I don't doubt his version of those events. I could easily see that being true. And so Strickland has gone on and he's had, the usual things to say about Jon Jones that I think are true. And in particular, saying things like, he's a fake Christian. He presents this fake redemption arc and expects everybody to get behind him and forgive all of his misdeeds. Whether it was something that, in all honesty, maybe is comparatively minor, getting in a car accident with a pregnant woman, that could happen to anybody. Leaving the scene, well, that's pretty bad. But it's not necessarily irredeemable. It's bad, but it's not irredeemable. Beating up his own fiancée in a Las Vegas hotel room, okay, now we're into irredeemable territory. At the very least, that is pretty damn tough to redeem. And that kind of brings me back to this whole Jon Jones the Redeemer little act that he's put on, quite often. As a matter of fact, I remember when he beat Cyril Gane to become the UFC heavyweight champion of the world. And then he got on the mic and he had his dad in the cage with him. And he got on the mic and started talking about like how Christian he is. And I remember watching that live and I just said to myself, fuck off with this bullshit. Because to sit there and get on the mic like you think you're Jon Jones the Redeemer, talking about like trying to play this off as if you're some kind of redeemed Christian. Where is the redemption arc here? When has Jon Jones even taken responsibility for any of these terrible things that he's done? Near as I can tell, never. Which kind of brings me back to the point that I was starting with, and that is that nobody has to like Sean Strickland, but when he says these things about Jon Jones, these things that he says are absolutely true. But now let's rewind a little bit again. Bear with me. This is a lot of rewinding, fast-forwarding, rewinding again, but let's rewind again to that scene that I was talking about. So Jon Jones has just defeated Cyril Gane to become the UFC heavyweight champion of the world, and he brings his dad into the cage. And he stands there with his dad, and he talks about his redemption story, his redemption through Christ. And his dad kind of does, I think, what maybe a lot of dads might do in that situation, and he just kind of sits there and he quietly nods along. And there's no indication that he's ever said anything to Jon Jones about it afterward and telling him it's like, hey, like if you want to try to portray yourself as this redeemed figure, well, then maybe you might actually want to do something that is, redeeming. There's no word that I've ever heard that he said something like that. Not that you would necessarily expect to see that become public. But you didn't. And to me, that kind of starts to push it a little bit in one particular direction. But now, the role of his two brothers in this backstage altercation at this UFC event, where his brothers are getting mad at Sean Strickland about the things that Sean Strickland has to say about Jon Jones, things that I think that in their heart of hearts, obviously they have to know to be true. Like, obviously they know that these things are true. And yet they're mad at Sean Strickland because he said these things. I guess they don't really have any problem with it. They must not have any problem with it. They must think that all of these things are pretty okay. The drug cheating. The hit and run with the pregnant lady. Pretty bad. But beating up on his fiancée. Okay. You could definitely, if you're Jon Jones's brother, I feel like you should probably be pretty mad at Jon Jones that he would do something like that and embarrass your family like that and cause you that amount of embarrassment by being associated familially with somebody who would do such a thing. But to get mad at the guy who just talks about it, to me, that seems like that's a bit of a stretch. Now, I've said one thing about Jon Jones over and over, both on this podcast and elsewhere, but realistically, Jon Jones becomes sort of an interesting figure when you consider the detail that, fight fans, they either look away from all of the things that he's done and they love him, or at the very least, they kind of look at him and they say, that's a guy that I would like to be able to love. He is definitely one of the best fighters of all time. I don't think that he's the greatest of all time in the UFC. I think that kind of comes down between Demetrius Johnson, Mighty Mouse, and George St. Pierre. Those are my GOAT candidates. Jon Jones is not a GOAT candidate in my view, but for a lot of people he is. And so a lot of people look at him and they would very much like to be able to say, they'd love to be able to say, hey, I love that guy. And there's some of them who just kind of ignore all of the terrible things that he's done, and they love him anyway. But there are a lot of people out there who have higher standards. And they say to themselves, I would love to be able to love this guy, but I can't. And I do understand that that's a little bit different if you're actually in his family. If you're actually one of his brothers, well, you're obligated to love him at least a little bit. But let's use that as an operative term, like at least a little bit. It probably doesn't go so far that you have to love him so much that you're going to go fight somebody who, to you, is a complete stranger just because he's saying all of the uncomfortable truths about your brother. It probably shouldn't go quite that far. I feel that it's probably all right to set something of a boundary around that sort of a thing. But apparently Jon Jones's brothers haven't done that, which really, to me, just kind of reveals to us, the answer to this question that I think that a lot of people have had, and that is, how could a guy like Jon Jones even just kind of think that he's just going to kind of brush all of this kind of stuff off and just go about his life and his career as if it never happened? And now we have the answer. He's able to do that because his family is apparently enabling him to do that. So much so that they are willing to go out of their way to fight somebody who, although, within this sport he's very famous, to them he's a complete stranger. To me, that doesn't say anything good about them. And it definitely doesn't say anything good about their dad. And in all honesty, it doesn't make Jon Jones himself look any bit better than that. And so to me, that's just one thing that makes it doesn't make it any easier to respect Jon Jones, and it definitely makes it a lot harder to respect his brothers. And that's a shame.